The Betrayal of Albion, Part 1, The City of London. This post is part 1 in a series that follows a long chain of events whereby the land of Albion was lost forever. Albion was the ancient name for the British Isles as attested by the Greeks from around 6 BC, whenever that was. Celtic linguist Hever de la Mare claims that it originally meant the world above, the visible world, as opposed to the world below, the underworld. The name Britannia or Britain was a latter development that came after the supposed Roman conquest, whatever that was. This was the beginning of the end for the land of Albion. These days, Albion is almost a myth, a legend, a computer game. Our historical knowledge of it is based upon legends, butchered to satisfy the egos of monarchs and nobles who all wanted desperately to be justified as its descendants. Albion belongs to the old civilization. The greatness of Great Britain can never match that of Albion. It lives on in people's souls, or it couldn't be crushed by the onslaught and betrayal it was so ill-equipped to withstand. This series of posts is about that onslaught and betrayal within which the city of London features significantly, as does the number 6 and the word great. It is hoped that by studying this chain of events, various patterns can be identified that may give clues to support alternative theories of history. Also, the arrogance and vanity of the perpetrators of these events may reveal more detail than was intended. It may also be possible to recognize these same patterns and details in our more recent history, which may add weight to the validity of any assumptions and theories that suggest themselves. This chain of events represents just one tiny thread in the spider's web, but hopefully it reaches further in towards the center. It's also possible that these entire chain of events never happened, but we have to work with what we've got. Please note that the dates and names have probably been changed or invented to protect the guilty. Also, the divide and rule conquer principle works both ways when the protagonists divide themselves into apparently opposing factions. The first and probably the most important thing to understand about the City of London is that it isn't the City of London. The city is a 1 square mile area that was once walled around its perimeter. By those pesky Romans, of course, everything else is just London. Today, the two Londons have separate city halls and elect separate mayors who collect separate taxes to fund separate police who enforce separate laws. The mayor of the City of London is known as the Right Honourable the Lord Mayor of London and wears a fancy costume in his golden carriage and works in the Guildhall. The City of London also has its own flag and crest, whilst London has neither. The corporation that runs the City of London claims to be older than the United Kingdom by several hundred years. William the Conqueror's excursion to Britain apparently came up against a slight hitch when he discovered the City of London sitting there on the river with its walls, bridge, and gates firmly closed. It is claimed that he agreed to recognize the traditional rights and privileges of the city as long as they acknowledged him as the new king. This flimsy and highly unlikely story is the basis of a 1,000-year-long tradition whereby even today, the mayor of London doesn't have any power over the City of London. It is generally believed that even the ruling monarch cannot just enter the city but must ask for permission from the Lord Mayor by means of a weird ritual, although this isn't actually true. The City of London also has a representative in Parliament and the House of Lords, the Remembrancer. Today his role is to protect the city's special rights, but in the past it was different. From its inception in 1570 during the reign of Elizabeth I and up until around the time of the Great Fire in 1666, the Remembrancer was just a secretary or archivist to the Lord Mayor. someone who remembers things. Nowadays, thanks to power of the remembrancer, laws passed by Parliament don't always apply to the City of London. By the time of Elizabeth I's reign, the City of London had become an essential part of daily life. It was the busiest port in the country and encompassed all of the facilities, administration, and trades for dealing with such a vast movement of goods. The superior military organization of the city forces, such as the train bands, the artillery company, and other kindred bodies, at a time when the standing army was in its infancy and viewed with disfavor by the people. The riches of the merchants, which ever offered to the crown the greatest facilities for borrowing money, and their extensive trade with foreign countries, necessitating as it did the employment of a vast number of vessels and men, and thus affording in times of emergency a means of rapidly and effectually increasing the navy, could not fail to enhance the power of the citizens in the councils of their sovereign. And breathe. That has to be one of the longest sentences since Charles Dickens. Between that time and now, something sinister took place and created the monster that is the City of London today. To understand the City of London, it's necessary to be aware of certain background information. Well, quite a bit of background information, actually. The Romans. Well, what Romans? Which Romans? It has been shown that the famous ancient Roman history by Cornelius Tacitus was really written by the Italian humanist Poggio Bracciolini, although there is another theory that even Poggio was an invention to put the rediscovery forgery of Tacitus' work further back in time. However, the same argument against the authenticity of Tacitus still applies. Therefore, there's nothing that can be said about them in relation to London or Britannia with any degree of certainty. Maybe there was an invasion of sorts, who knows, when the saints go marching in. The official narrative requires we believe that there were 3 well-established Christian bishops in Britannia by 314. Missionaries were regularly being sent to Britain from around 429 onwards in an attempt to combat paganism, or in other words, to add momentum to the old divide and rule ploy, and therefore destroy Albion. The missionaries would ingratiate themselves with those in positions of power and to do their best to convert them to the salvation through suffering doctrine of Christianity, and if they could secure a nice plot of land for a monastery, so much the better. They would learn all that they could about the native belief system, history, and power structure with the specific intention of undermining it. They would exploit delicate relationships between local leaders and cause whatever friction they could. They even almost managed to cause a civil war in the 10th century when the Benedictines arrived with their reforms in order to divide the new Christian converts against each other. Later in the 16th century, these advanced scouting party missionaries would become organized into the Jesuits. Anglo-Saxon London. As far as is known, the Anglo-Saxon city of London wasn't granted any more liberties than those given in many other borough and town charters, as well as those of the Cinque Ports. In the Anglo-Saxon era, very little legislation dealt with London in particular. Even less so did the Crown grant special privileges to London, not least since it was not a town of major significance for most of that time. Anglo-Saxon laws, which are known of and which made specific reference to London, comprise certain laws which were probably issued circa 930-40 and which are called Athelstan 6. They are also called the Indicia Civitates Londoniae. These mainly relate to guilds. Certain laws which were probably issued circa 991-1002 and which are called the laws of Ethelred 4. They relate to tolls and to the trading rights of foreigners in respect of London. What about other liberties that might have been given to London by the Anglo-Saxons but which have been lost in the mists of time? Grants of liberties in Anglo-Saxon times were generally limited in nature. For example, the Cinque Ports were granted rights of sack and sock as well as of toll and theme, the right to levy fines for Bloodwhite, Fledwyd, and Montbryce. These may also have been granted to the citizens of London as well as others of a similar ilk. As for liberties existing from 1066 1215, lists common franchises granted by the Crown post 1066 to the extent that London was granted any of these, and who knows, because they have not otherwise been recorded in a charter. The imaginary invasion of Albion. Most studies of Jews in medieval England begin with the year 1066 when Jews first arrived on English soil. Yet the absence of Jews in England before the conquest did not prevent early English authors from writing obsessively about them, using material from the writings of the Church Fathers, contemporary continental sources, widespread cultural stereotypes, and their own imaginations. Their depictions of Jews reflected their own politico-theological experiences. The 13 essays in Imagining the Jew in Anglo-Saxon Literature and Culture examine visual and textual representations of Jews, the translation and interpretation of Scripture, the use of Hebrew words and etymologies, and the treatment of Jewish spaces and landmarks. By studying the imaginary Jews of Anglo-Saxon England, they offer new perspectives on the treatment of race, religion, and ethnicity in pre- and post-conquest literature and culture. The only substantial religious minority in early medieval Western Europe, the Jews, was entirely absent from England before the Norman conquest. Absent in reality, but not at the imaginative level, where the Jews played a substantial role in Anglo-Saxon culture. The study of imaginary things is common practice these days, but this rather takes the biscuit, as they say. It is very reminiscent of the British Israelite movement that appeared in the early 1880s. As already stated, the Roman history of Tacitus was a much later forgery, which makes it even more unlikely that there were Jews in England before 1066. The most ancient manuscripts of the Hebrew texts date from the 8th century, and there can have been many of those around in Anglo-Saxon Britain, and even less people who could actually read them. Bibles didn't make an appearance until the 15th century, and yet we are supposed to believe that the early Christian Anglo-Saxons were enamored and besotted with the Jews. The teachings of Christianity blame the Jews for Christ's crucifixion, a point that the Anglo-Saxons must have been aware of. In spite of this, they worshipped the Jews and based their culture on them in order to build a new Israel. Then, when their Jewish heroes finally arrive in 1066, they begin persecuting them. Why? Accusations of blood libel arose soon after, alongside those of well poisoning and host desecration. Within 300 years, these Jewish immigrants to the new Israel had been banished from Albion completely. None of this makes any sense unless it's an attempt to insinuate the Jews into ancient British history and give validity to any claims they may wish to make regarding it. Perhaps it's baiting for a Mandela effect. Concerning Judaism. In the Doctrine of Suffering post, I attempted to show that there has been a secret cult hidden deep within Judaism since its inception. This cult uses Judaism for its own purposes. At various times, glimpses of this cult have emerged from within the mainstream religion, the Ashkenazi and Zionism, for example. The most indicative of the secret cult's true nature is Sabbatean Frankism. It was instigated by the Jewish Kabbalists and is the equivalent of Satanism, but in a Jewish context. The Sabbatine Frankists deliberately infiltrate other religions, cults, and organizations in order to subvert them. Their trademark can be seen within socialism, communism, Freemasonry, the Hollywood cult, the Mafia, the Jesuits, the WHO, the media monopoly, unregulated immigration promoters, and many, many more institutions. The everyday, normal Jewish person is mostly unaware of this, or at best sees it as anti Semitic persecution. What follows exposes the agenda of this secret internal cult as it played out through Judaism. Any perceived hostility is aimed at this cult, not at the Jewish faith people. The Jewish invasion or invitation. Localism was close to the heart of Northern European Jews who thought of themselves as belonging to a town more than to a region. From the archives of Charlemagne's son, Louis the Pieux, we have 3 Latin charters of privilege that he issued to Jewish international merchants whom he encouraged to trade in the empire by offering them incentives of toll exemptions. He also promised them protection directly from his own court. The private charters that Louis issued to individual Jewish merchants became the model for later community charters of protection that began to appear in 1084 for the newly founded Jewish community of Speyer, a spin-off of the earlier ones of Mainz, settled in the late 10th century, and Worms, settled perhaps a few decades later. In his Latin charter, Rudiger, Bishop of Speyer, notes that he was welcoming Jews who might want to settle in his town. A Hebrew account tells us that a fire had broken out in Mainz and Jews there were homeless. Rudiger offered the Mainz Jewish refugees his personal protection, self-government, and even a strong wall around their area of settlement so that Christian commercial competitors in town would not be tempted to harm their new Jewish neighbors. Rudiger invited them to settle in Speyer because he thought the Jews could help him increase the prestige of Speyer by making a village into a town. Many other rulers invited Jews into northern Europe in the 11th and 12th centuries and confirmed their protection and utility to the kingdom, usually as international merchants with similar community charters. During these times, Jews and Christians generally got along, and the settled life in towns like Mainz in the Rhineland or Troyes in the county of Champagne saw the emergence of an early rabbinic elite that was part of the commercial middle class the Jewish settlers were forming. So we have Christian bishops inviting Jewish immigrants into Christian settlements, isolating them from the rest of the town, then giving them special treatment and protection, thus creating a rabbinic elite. Does this sound crazy to you? It's no wonder they needed protection. In the 11th and 12th century, a traumatic event took place, generating a religious ideology that would shape not just the elite that constructed it, but also the entire culture of Ashkenaz for all time. In small rabbinical circles in northern Europe, Rabbi Shalom ben Yitzchak Troyes, known as Rashi, wrote his running commentary to most of the Hebrew Bible and to the Babylonian Talmud. They are both still widely studied today. Rashi's grandsons built a major intellectual palace of synthesis on the basis of Rashi's Talmudic commentary. The intellectual achievement of these Tosafists, Talmud glossators, resulted in the expansion of new categories of Jewish law and practice, in effect making a formerly Mediterranean and Islamic Jewish culture into the Jewish culture of northern Christian Europe, or Ashkenaz. This presents a rabbinic elite of middle-class merchants who invent a new Judaic ideology that redefines the entire culture of northern Christian Europe for all time. The dating of this event coincides with the arrival and establishment of Jewish communities in northern Europe in spite of the unsubstantiated claims that they arrived with the Romans. Could this be an invasion of Ashkenaz, northern Europe, and or the origin of Zionism? Does the rabbit hole go even deeper? Were the Roman Catholic clergy in on it? There's that Roman word again. Did the Jews actually arrive with the Romans? Not the biggest, dickest Hail Caesar ones, but the Catholic ones. Meanwhile, back in Albion, after the Anglo-Saxons had been thoroughly established by the early Christian proto-Jesuit Romano-Catholic missionaries, they were ripe for a takeover. Enter William the Conqueror and his Jews in 1066.